who were here earlier. And if we're able to end a little bit earlier with the dire weather forecast for this afternoon, I'm sure nobody would object. We're really very pleased to have this session today. Excited to have two very strong speakers here with us to talk about this topic of the return of great power naval rivalry, something obviously that has a lot of historic resonance, I think, for the United States and for other major powers in the international system over hundreds of years, and I think certainly something that we're beginning to see again today. We're quite grateful to Fincantieri for supporting a new series that we're doing on this topic. This is the first meeting, and we hope that all of you will be able to be with us for subsequent sessions. Today we want to talk kind of concretely about the challenges that the United States faces, particularly from China and Russia, which clearly are the two most consequential rivals at this point. And we're really very, very pleased to have with us, to my far left, Toshi Yoshihara, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment, previously the John A. Van Beuren Chair of Asia Pacific Studies at the Naval War College, really a very distinguished scholar and expert on the PLA Navy with an extensive record of publication on that topic. And then to my immediate left, Dmitry Gorenberg, who's a senior research scientist at CNA, an organization where I'm also affiliated and occasionally contribute. In Dmitry's case, an expert, of course, on the Russian Navy, Russian foreign policy, and doing all kinds of other things, an associate at the Davis Center at Harvard. I'm sorry, Dmitry, I don't always remember all of them, and the editor of Problems of Post-Communism. So we're very pleased to have Dmitry with us today as well, and I think we'll have a lively exchange of views. So we agreed to start with Toshi. Each of the two speakers will talk for about 10 minutes, then we'll open it up for questions and comments. So Toshi, please take it away.
Great. Paul, thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's a real pleasure for me to be here to speak to you about Chinese naval strategy. Paul's actually laid out a lot of topics to cover. What I'd like to do is focus on really 3 points, and then hopefully we can cover the rest that I leave on the table during the Q&A. So I'm just going to make 3 points about Chinese naval strategy. Firstly, to put it in the context of China's long-term goals. Well, what does China want, and how does sea power and naval power being an element of that help to support China's long-term goals? The second is naval strategy itself, but focused particularly in terms of functional area and geographical area in the near seas, what China wants to do in its immediate periphery. And again, we can talk a bit more about what China wants to do beyond the near seas, the so-called far seas, during the Q&A, hopefully. And then the third is talk a little bit about the how. How do the Chinese tactically think about defending the near seas, and I want to focus on China's very missile-centric tactical approach to this maritime problem. So let me start with what does China want? And I think a good proxy for what China wants is the China Dream, Xi Jinping's China Dream that he's articulated on many occasions, especially most prominently during the 19th Party Congress, the all-important Chinese Communist Party meeting that really set out China's goals for the next 5 years or so. And so I want to talk a little bit firstly then about the intersection of the China Dream and Chinese sea power, of which naval power is a part. So Xi Jinping's China Dream is about ensuring that China becomes very wealthy and very powerful, and that he believes that the sea power is certainly a path to greater wealth and power. China Dream is a mid-century goal that envisions vaulting China to the front ranks of great powers, basically China become a co-equal with the great powers across the board, from economics to diplomacy to China's strategic position and so forth. Now, while economics is front and center, it's one of the key goals is to make China prosperous, there are in fact external manifestations of the China Dream. I think what you can discern from various speeches by Xi about the China Dream is that China would like to emerge, or re-emerge, to be more accurate, to re-emerge as the epicenter of East Asian international politics. And what that implies for the United States is a substantial reduction of American power and influence in Asia. As the National Defense Strategy states very bluntly, right? China wants to be a regional hegemon and displace the United States. I'm paraphrasing here. And to the extent that Chinese sea power and the naval component of Chinese sea power can nudge or even muscle out the United States from the region, you can say then, therefore, that naval power is in fact a key part of the China Dream. The China Dream is also intimately related to Taiwan, which is of course one of the scenarios or crises that we potentially could foresee where China and the United States could come to blows. To Xi, without Taiwan, China cannot be whole or complete. And so only with Taiwan then can the dream be achieved, right? And so this means that to the extent that Chinese sea power can help to achieve the goal of unification, that too is an element of the China Dream. The One Belt, One Road initiative is also a very important part of the so-called rejuvenation process. The China Dream is also, to use a different phrase, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So of course, there's clearly a global maritime component to the initiative, and therefore sea power and naval power is intimately related to that initiative as well. So there are things that are related to China closer to home. There's a regional dimension, but there's also increasingly a global dimension. Xi Jinping made it very clear that naval power was part of the China Dream in many of his most important speeches, and that it's intimately related to another dream, the strong military dream, which sees China vaulting to the front ranks of great military powers by mid-century as well. And it was in May of 2017 that Xi Jinping, in a speech to the naval cadre, explicitly told the Chinese Navy to become a powerful Navy in order to fulfill the strong military dream. And in fact, to become a part of what Xi Jinping calls a world-class military by mid-century. And then in April 2018, when he reviewed the massive naval parade in the South China Sea, he again stated, and he reformulated his goals to ensure that the Chinese Navy would become a world-class Navy. Now, I want to put this in a broader historical context, that this isn't as much of a break as is continuity. China Dream and sea power, I would argue, goes all the way back to Deng Xiaoping during the era of reform and opening. He foresaw the important connection between reform and opening, the key to Chinese wealth and power, and sea power. To rise, China was going to be increasingly dependent on seaborne commerce, and Deng recognized that China needed a coherent maritime strategy and the foundations for sea power. As early as August of 1979, so almost 40 years ago, Deng Xiaoping told the naval cadre that China could no longer look at the seas as a moat, but increasingly must treat the seas as a highway for trade and commerce, the foundations of China's growth that we see to this very day. And so he then concluded to the naval cadre, there is no turning back. China must go to sea. And so I think Xi's China Dream, although far more ambitious than Deng's reform and opening, is really a continuation of this trend line. Now I want to talk about the second part, which is naval strategy itself. And I want to frame this in the context of Chinese discussion of this concept of active defense. Chinese official writings frequently talk about two kinds of missions that the Chinese Navy need to fulfill: near seas defense and far seas operations. They are both interrelated, but they have different functional and geographical responsibilities. I'll focus on the near seas and leave the far seas for further discussion during the Q&A. So to understand near seas defense, we have to understand the concept of active defense as a military strategy, which I define in Clausewitzian terms as the use of the engagement for the purposes of the war, whatever the war might be. Active defense, simply defined, is the use of offensive operations and tactics to defend China's strategically defensive goals, however those goals may be defined. Those goals usually refers to China's most vital national interest, or what the Chinese call core interests, including such things as Taiwan. And active defense is triggered when deterrence fails and frequently involves high-end conventional combat. What's interesting, if you read Chinese doctrinal writings, that active defense has a very concrete opponent in mind. They describe this in oblique terms, though, of a powerful adversary with expeditionary forces armed with long-range precision strike weaponry that can threaten targets deep inside the Chinese homeland. Of course, the Chinese never identify this opponent, but of course, it's us, okay? They've been talking about us as the powerful enemy or powerful adversary for decades. The operational problem, as the doctrinal framers see it, is that U.S. forces can outstick or outrange Chinese forces, meaning that U.S. forces can launch offensive at such standoff distances that they would be beyond the reach of the retaliatory forces on the Chinese side. And of course, this is no longer the case, right? At the tactical level, that equation has been reversed. In terms of surface warfare, we're frequently the ones that are being outsticked or outranged. But nevertheless, I think the principle still stands that the United States has a whole host of long-range firepower that can threaten the Chinese homeland. And so to deal with this threat, the goal of active defense is to defend as far forward from the Chinese homeland as possible, right? To keep U.S. forces at bay as far forward as possible, to create a buffer zone that separates U.S. forces from China's most important strategic, political, economic targets along the mainland, right? The hub of all Chinese power these days are located along the coast. So China can no longer afford to use the Maoist concept of luring the enemy in deep. They actually have to defend forward. So active defense would employ offensive strikes launched from the mainland and from the near seas, that would include the Yellow Sea, East China Sea, and the South China Sea, to conduct what the Chinese call deterrent operations. And the geographic scope of these deterrent operations now have expanded to include large parts of the Western Pacific, and it's really a massive strategic arc that stretches from the Western Pacific all the way into the northern Indian Ocean, into the Bay of Bengal. And you can imagine near seas defense then, I think, falling within this construct of active defense. It is essentially active defense at sea, employing all implements of naval power. And the key elements of that would be the use of long-range over-the-horizon firepower, what the Chinese call joint firepower strikes, with missiles playing a prominent role, in some ways replicating the long-range precision strike of U.S. forces. So with that, I'm going to transition to my last part of my talk, which is Chinese sea power in the missile age. I want to talk a little bit about the how. How would near-sea defense be operationalized? And I think China's missile-centric approach is at least one way of thinking about how China would implement active defense to defend this very large defensive perimeter. Chinese strategists, and this is based on Chinese doctrinal writings, have discerned the character of future naval combat. They believe that the future combat will be extremely intense, extremely lethal, and very quick. They foresee all types of advanced weaponry being used by both sides, especially long-range, over-the-horizon, precision strike munitions, and that both sides, both combatants, would seek quick, decisive engagements, a quick, decisive victory. And so what they see then in an engagement is a spasm of strike and counterstrike. One authoritative Chinese article foresees that hundreds of missiles would be launched on both sides within about 10 minutes. And what they envision is really the possibility that one side could lose a single fleet in an afternoon. So these technological trends about the precision, lethality, and range of missiles in particular, they see pushing both sides to want to strike first. The idea that the side that's able to punch first and land the first blow would be able to achieve the battlefield initiative. When I talk about this, I think people then tell me it reminds them of the Battle of the First Salvo, something that Dimitri can probably speak to in greater depth. But of course, it's not inconsistent with the way we view fleet tactics. If you read Wayne Hughes's work, right, it's about scouting, being able to find the enemy first and being able to attack first. But I think the Chinese writing suggests that we need to be aware about what this means in terms of escalation control. Now, to relieve the reader or the audience of any doubt that the Chinese have us in mind, I've come across multiple Chinese articles that explicitly use the Arleigh-Burke destroyer, which is the workhorse of the U.S. Navy, as a mock target in their experiments, in writing their articles. One study, for example, talks about how to defeat the organic defenses of the Arleigh-Burke destroyer. They, in their experiments, they concluded that if you could fire two high-altitude supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles coming at different vectors, two sea-skimming long-range anti-ship cruise missiles, also supersonic, coming at different vectors, and then you plop on top of that an anti-ship ballistic missile, they're fairly confident, based on their experiments, that something would get through. Now, I don't know how good those experiments are, and in terms of the tactical fidelity of what they were doing, but the point, I think, of the article was that they're thinking very explicitly about the United States as an opponent. And I should also add, the article that I'm citing was published in 2002. That's 7 to 8 years before the anti-ship ballistic missile craze kind of took over Washington. So again, it reinforces this idea that they've been thinking about great power competition, a great power war at sea for quite some time. So let me conclude very briefly by simply saying that the Chinese Navy and Chinese sea power that we're talking about today is very different from the one that we were talking about 10 to 15 years ago. It's not the Navy that we were accustomed to in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. China not only has the ambitions, but increasingly the means to achieve those ambitions. So I think it is appropriate, in terms of the purpose of this panel, to think about this as the future of great power naval rivalries. And then I'll take the other issues that I've raised during the Q&A. I look forward to your thoughts. Thank you.
Dimitri, please.
Thank you.
And thank you, Toshi. Very
yeah,
provocative.
This is very interesting because there are a lot more parallels, I think, between China and Russia than I expected before I listened to Toshi. But I want to start by just highlighting one thing, which I think is also in some ways a similarity with China, which is that Russia is primarily a land power and always has been, and the Navy plays a supporting role and always will. So that's just something that we should keep in mind as we talk about the Navy and naval confrontation, is that the balance between the services is very different in Russia versus the United States. So, but let me start, and this is kind of a very abbreviated version of something much more in depth and longer that I've given in other contexts. So I'm just going to hit a few highlights, and we can go into more depth in the discussion. Let me start by talking a little bit about Russian naval strategy and missions as they've developed now, and as I see them developing over the next decade or so. The one thing that I think is still has been one constant is that strategic deterrence remains the primary mission, which includes not just the SSBNs, but the submarines and other forces that provide security and defenses for the SSBNs. And that's and the Soviet Navy was really built around protecting those SSBNs, and it was the only area that continued to receive financing in the 90s and the early 2000s. So that capability was maintained much better than some of the other ones. So that remains key mission. Second key mission, coastal defense and control of territorial waters, very close second. Traditionally, that just meant keeping foreign navies away from the Russian coast. Now it's a little bit different. There's a lot more of an emphasis on working with ground forces on joint operations, also with air forces. So they've gotten much more into combined kind of operations among all these services than it was traditional in Russian military doctrine, but it's something they've been really focusing on and practicing in the last 5-8 years for sure. The key thing to remember about that mission, coastal defense and control of territorial waters, is that it's the Navy is designed to achieve that more through capability than through platforms. In other words, they're not focused as much on, okay, how many ships, where we're going to put them, but more on just the mission itself. So this is why they're building many small ships with kind of an A2AD focus, because that seemed to them, and probably given some of the constraints, I'll talk about it towards the end, they realized that this was the fastest way to get that capability up and running. So the third big mission is sea denial and A2AD. And that's creating maritime zones that are difficult for enemy forces to penetrate. Again, a lot of parallels, I think, with what you were talking about with China. We've talked about, you see lots of articles about A2AD bubbles and, circles around the Black Sea and Baltic and so forth. But there is, and some of it can be, there's certainly a bit of hype there, but there is a core essence to it that's correct, which is that Russian military is really focused on using a combination of long-range sea, air, and ground-launched missiles to deny access for enemy forces. And then a kind of shorter range coastal and air defense systems to focus more on the area denial aspect, and so you have kind of a series of layered defenses and multiple vectors of attack that make it very hard to break into zones that Russia wants to protect. So those are the three big missions, and I'll just quickly mention the smaller missions. One is status projection, just kind of showing the flag, projecting the image of a great power, going, that's a lot of the older capital surface ships going out and doing that sort of thing. There's a very limited focus on traditional power projection, kind of expeditionary warfare. We saw some, especially now with Syria. There's a little bit of that, but the one thing that I think we have to keep in mind is that the out-of-area deployment capability is likely, if anything, to deteriorate a bit in the short term, as some of these legacy Soviet-era large combat ships become less reliable, and we're seeing that now with the Moscow cruiser, the Kuznetsov. Now that the Russian dock sank, and who knows when it'll, if ever, if Kuznetsov will be back. So we're seeing this, and they haven't really built much in the way of replacement large combat ships. So that's something to keep in mind. There is power projection, but it's primarily submarine based, and that's really, if you talk to U.S. admirals in Sixth Fleet or wherever, what they're not worried about Russian combat ships. They're worried about Russian submarines. So that's where the focus of the Russian Navy is. And the legacy surface fleet is much more kind of focused on status projection, let's call it, rather than power projection. And then there's the last one thing I'll say about this topic. There's a new objective, which is a kind of establishing credible conventional deterrence versus the U.S. and NATO. And so this is the Kaliber land attack cruise, long-range cruise missiles that are being put on anything that can hold, 8 of them. And the idea is that here we can stick this missile on this small ship that can be relatively cheap to build, quick to build. It has a range of 2,500 kilometers. It can threaten. Now we can threaten Berlin or Rome or wherever. So, and if you put it on a submarine, it can threaten the United States. So that's the idea. Now, in terms of geography, Russia remains primarily a regional rather than a global power as far as the Navy is concerned. So there's a real focus on a regular presence in the Mediterranean, the Med Squadron, the refurbishing the base in Syria, all part of that. There's a desire to have as much sea control in the Arctic as possible, bolstering the Northern Fleet SSBN bastion, gaining visibility on increasing maritime traffic through the Northern Sea Route, all those reasons. The Far East and the Baltic are less important for the Navy. There was a time before the crisis in relations with the West where it seemed to me like the Pacific there was going to be a lot of emphasis on rebuilding the Pacific Fleet, and that might actually become more important than the Northern Fleet. That stopped after 2014. So really kind of a shift back to Europe as the key theater. So that's kind of the strategy side. Paul had asked me to talk a little briefly about capabilities, so I'll say a couple words there. As I've already indicated, submarines are and will remain the core strength of the naval force, particularly the nuclear submarines. They're supposedly modernizing some of the Soviet submarines, retrofitting them with advanced weapon systems, caliber and so forth, in order so they could pose a pretty serious threat to adversary surface combatants and then to critical infrastructure ashore in the ways I just described. But there's been little progress. And it's a very slowly, it appears that there have been lots of great pronouncements about six modernized Akulas, 4 modernized Oscars, might be the other way around, but very, very slow progress in terms of actually getting those submarines equipped with all this equipment. The Yasen submarines are very worrying if they all come online as planned. They plan to have 7 by 2025. We'll see. There's one that's in the force now and one that's in sea trials. So very expensive, but powerful. Can launch 40 caliber cruise missiles, for example. They're working on air-independent propulsion for non-nuclear submarines, but it's not clear when that design will be ready. And in the meantime, they just keep building more kilos as needed. There are aspirations for destroyers, big amphibious ships, new carriers. That's largely fantasy. It's not where the Russian Navy's at. And so I just don't think that's really something that we need to worry about, at least for the next decade. We'll see. I mean, down the road, who knows? But yeah. So the limitations of the are, as I mentioned, they try to ameliorate through this focus on cruise missiles, which are seen as potent force multipliers, capable of offsetting the Russian shortfalls in numbers and quality of their ships. They build small multi-mission ships that can support both their defensive and their deterrence goals at the same time. Corvettes, frigates, and so this is kind of a recognition that Russia primarily needs a fleet that can both protect its maritime approaches and hold adversary critical infrastructure at risk, and that's been spelled out in the Russia's new naval doctrine as well. So that's kind of the focus, and that's what I come back to what I said at the beginning, where capabilities are more important than platforms. A navy doesn't need large tonnage ships to incorporate advanced long-range weapon systems, and that's a lesson that the Russian Navy has really learned in the last 5-10 years. So the question is, how achievable is all this? There have been a lot of delays. Now, any major armament program is subject to delays in any part of the world, so that's not that unusual. But there are structural problems that I'll just quickly mention. We can go into more detail if we want. Long-term decline in naval R&D over the 90s and the 2000s that has had carry-on effects now. There's been an ongoing inability to modernize the shipbuilding industry. Increasingly severe budgetary constraints in the last few years. Western sanctions and the end of defense cooperation with Ukraine, which particularly hit the engine side for ships. And so those are some of the constraints. So let me just conclude by talking a little bit about how I see the Russian Navy evolving in the next 10, 15 years. In the near to medium term, it's going to remain primarily a coastal defense and deterrence force. Power projection is going to remain a pipe dream for at least 15 years, with the caveat that the submarines can certainly do some power projection, but there's a limited number of them. Out-of-area deployment capability is likely to deteriorate in the medium term as the Soviet-era big ships age and become less reliable. So, but the Russian Navy is transitioning from these kind of unattainable blue water aspirations that the admirals never really wanted to give up to a fairly capable green water force. In the near term, the overall focus is going to be defensive, with submarine-based power projection a potential in the medium term. And there's this potential to threaten U.S. allies and NATO assets with the cruise missiles. And if you base those cruise missiles on small ships in enclosed seas, that can really be very hard to counter. And that, I think, was, when they first launched those cruise missiles from the Caspian Sea at Syria, that was why they did it from there. Because it certainly wasn't necessary for the Syria operation, but it was necessary as a demonstration of the capability. So what you have is the Russian Navy as a more potent regional threat than it has been in the past. Greater firepower plus a range of offensive fires despite the small platforms. And there's been an initial focus on building up an A2AD environment in the Black Sea and the Baltic. And there's going to be followed by a rollout of similar capabilities in the Arctic, and then down the road in the Pacific, but again, lower priority. So that's where the Russian Navy is. There's little prospect of a global threat from the Navy, even in the longer term. And these aspirational goals of a blue water Navy are largely countered by a pragmatic strategy that's focused on these kind of more achievable, limited objectives. So I'll stop there and you can have a discussion.
Great, thanks very much, Dimitri. I think our two speakers have given us a great deal to chew on, so let's open it up for questions and discussion. And I saw one back here, and please identify yourselves.
Yeah, I'm, I don't have to use my stage. I'm Mike Lehos, Johns Hopkins. Maybe I will use my stage voice. Okay, in the many decades since the last Great Sea War, it is perhaps inevitable that naval activity would shift into the realm of the ceremonial, including airstrike choreography, incidents at sea ballet, and also the vast literature, and I mean literature, of war planning, and the pageantry of naval exercises, port visits, etc. And this is a longer period even than the period before World War I, where there at least was some major naval combat activity before 1914. And what this means, I think, over time from a cultural perspective, is that navies inevitably shift their concept of fleet design, the preferred ships they build, and the actual visions of the next war into a more ceremonial realm. And we see this in terms of the literature of future war. The literature of future war, and I mean it's very literary, imagines a certain kind of war and builds toward it. And yet, as we've seen in the past, and is more likely, I think, even today, if a war somehow were to happen, the probability is it would diverge massively from the imagination of these literary fantasies. And so I would just want to ask you, from the two different perspectives, one a more modest resurgence of Russian sea power, and then the far more Mahanian and far-reaching vision that the Chinese have. How can you reflect on this in terms of the dangers it poses if by some odd chance there is a big war? And second, are, say, the Chinese, I wouldn't include the Russians here because I think they are aware of this, but are the Chinese completely aware in their hearts that there is a threshold, a ceremonial threshold of activity and intensity and aggressiveness that you cannot go beyond? Or are they willing to take more risks under certain circumstances?
Okay. So I think I'll start with the dangerous element of the way the Chinese talk about not just sea power, but their military strategy writ large. I mean, what I've detected over the years in their doctrinal writings is a tendency to sort of imagine best case scenarios where they believe that with the use of precision strike capabilities that they're empowered with this ability to signal very precisely their intentions to the other side, right? So I think some of you may have heard about Chinese doctrinal writing saying, you know, if we wanted to scare the Americans away, all we needed to do is launch an anti-ship ballistic missile and have it drop maybe 250 meters port side of the carrier. That would turn the Americans back, right? That is this tendency to choreograph their operations and tactics without really considering the larger considerations about escalation. Without considering the fact that the United States, the local commander, and also folks, the national command authority, might actually read that in a very different way, that in fact their ideas of to escalate to de-escalate ends up escalating. So, you know, my main fear in reading the doctrinal writings is that they buy into their own script. They buy into the narrative that they've spun for themselves and not to seriously consider the dangers of escalation. However, I do want to talk about another element of this, which is I think it's important to think about Chinese sea power and naval power in particular in the peacetime context, that there is a peacetime utility of the military instrument. And we are in fact right now engaged in some ways in a war of perceptions, that we're trying to persuade and convince the other side based on the posturing, the types of movements that we make in, I say we, the Chinese, you know, when they look at their instrument, the way they're posturing themselves, the way they're operating in that domain is meant to shape our perceptions as well about their capabilities. So when we see their new equipment being splashed on the internet and the newspapers and on TV, this is as much with the domestic audience in mind as it is about trying to shape perceptions both the United States and of its allies. When the Chinese show off their missiles or their warships, when they break through, right? I mean, there's no such thing as break it, but when they break through the first island chain, when they sortie a naval flotilla through the first island chain, or when they conduct an encirclement patrol around Taiwan, right, with their bombers, those are in some ways coercive posturing, right? The use of the military instrument in peacetime uses in order to shift its potential adversaries' cost and benefit analysis in peacetime. So I think we need to keep that in mind when we think about a straight sort of, you know, assessment of the naval balance between the United States and China, is that it's not just scenarios in which deterrence fails. Right. It is as much about their constant use of the military instrument in peacetime and how that influences the way we perceive them and perceive ourselves. And I would say one thing that I've been tracking is Chinese commentary about the U.S. Navy's collisions. Right? What does that say to them? Are they now telling them a false narrative about U.S. naval power? So I think it's important to keep that contest of perceptions in mind. So I think you raise a really important point. Thanks.
Just quickly on the Russian, Russian views of the choreography, they've been very aware, as I think you realize, they've been very aware of this from day one. The navies are very useful for political purposes, right? They can go, you can send a ship to some place where they would never let your army enter, for example, right? And having those leftover Soviet legacy ships that were impressive and large was very useful for many years when they didn't really have much else going for it. So, and once they had the money for the fuel, they could send them out. And I remember probably 10 years ago at this point, a lot of attention being paid to the Russian Navy's Caribbean cruise, right? And there was this nice war of shaping perceptions with that, because on the one hand, the Russians say, "Hey, we're in Venezuela, we're in Nicaragua, we're in Cuba." On the other hand, I remember all of us analysts in the West pointing out, "Hey, yes, they are, and they brought their tugboat in case they break down along the way," right? So there's a game that's going on there. but there's a different kind of posturing that's been done more recently that I think is also important to highlight, which is the more aggressive buzzing of the Donald Cook and the other buzzing of the Donald Cook and and so there is an effort to shape a perception of the Russians as willing to take risks to stand up for themselves, right? And I think that was done. We haven't seen as much of that recently because I think the point they sort of figured they made their point, and they don't want an actual, like, they know that these are risky maneuvers and they don't actually want a problem, so they made their point. And that's I think something that is all. But the perception that the Navy, the use of the Navy can create in peacetime is something that's very much on their minds.
How damaging was the Kuznetsov failure on Syria?
Damaging in terms of perceptions, you mean? I mean, I don't think it was very damaging from vis-a-vis the United States because we all kind of know that it's a failure. I don't know. I don't really track how third parties perceive the Russian Navy, and so there might, I don't know, maybe some people. But the Kuznetsov, everyone knows, has been a sailing disaster area every time it gets underway, and it's been true for years, probably since it started sailing, more or less. So the I don't think it changed anybody's views of what it can accomplish.
Amy in the back.
Amy Comer from Chevron. I actually think you probably just answered my question, which was a discussion about the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov recent skirmishes and whether or not it was a lot of political posturing, but you kind of touched on it. But if you have anything more to add about capabilities in that area and kind of potential for escalation, I would appreciate hearing about it because we have ships in the area. Thank you.
Sure. I think that I have a whole separate talk on that, but there was a desire to show to Ukraine who's boss in yes, we have an agreement on sharing the Azov Sea and the Kerch Strait and so forth, but we are, as the more powerful force in the area, we the Russians control access, and they wanted to demonstrate that, whereas the Ukrainians had their own goals in terms of demonstrating either that they can go through, therefore Russia doesn't have the full sovereignty over the strait, and therefore over Crimea, that it says it does, or Russia's, or the alternative, which is that Russia doesn't let them go through, in which case they're aggressive, right, and violate international maritime law and so forth. So I think that was that. In terms of what happens next, my guess is that at some point the Ukrainians will send some more ships through, and they will follow the Russian unilateral kind of rules for passage under the bridge, and the Russians will then let them through. But you never know. There are lots of domestic political considerations in Ukraine that could affect this. There are international, both bilateral and multilateral considerations that could make it go in a different way. So I don't exclude the risk of another confrontation, but I think it's lower than it might one might think.
My colleague George Beebe, who is about to become our new vice president and director of studies.
Thanks. We had an event here not very long ago where Dimitri Simes, our organization's president, and Graham Allison from Harvard talked about Chinese-Russian friendship and the development of closer and closer cooperations between those two countries. One of the things that Graham Allison said in the course of that discussion was that in the event of some sort of U.S.-China naval confrontation, a Taiwan Straits type scenario, he was absolutely convinced that the Russians would undertake some moves of their own, militarily, beyond sending subs under the Arctic ice, for example, staging a provocation in the Baltics or something else that would either take advantage of the lack of U.S. focus or to simply complicate the military situation for the U.S. I'm wondering if you could comment on that sort of scenario, recognizing there's no obligation on the part of the Russians to do anything that might benefit the Chinese, and also if you could comment on whether the Chinese might do something similar in the event of a U.S.-Russian crisis of some kind, taking advantage of our lack of focus to do something in the South China Sea that they might see as advantageous. And in turn, what are the implications of that sort of multi-front crisis for U.S. naval planning?
And maybe I can add another layer onto that, because I think there is another layer actually to it. So they've been doing joint exercises. And actually those have extended now beyond the Pacific. So to the extent that you can form a judgment, how effective are those exercises? Is there any kind of coordination process that's developing? Is it, as people have described in the past, kind of two ships sailing next to each other? Or is there sort of something more than that? That if we got into some kind of a conflict situation with one of them where they would actually not just maybe want politically or be tempted politically to support one another, but there would be sort of an operational capability.
Right, well, let me take the Russia side. Maybe Toshi can take the China. I am a bit skeptical, to be honest, about the Graham Allison. I hate to go against Graham Allison, but I think and it comes to me. For me, it comes from my assessment of Russia's larger goals, which, to my mind, are primarily defensive in nature, and that they want to protect themselves. Now, sometimes the best defense is a good offense, so they certainly have undertaken aggressive action in certain circumstances. But I don't think that it's just a question of, hey, the U.S. is distracted, so let's grab something, whatever. If there is some purpose, if they feel like they're threatened by the U.S. in some location, and this provides an opportunity to reduce that threat, then sure. They're certainly quite good at acting opportunistically when circumstances present themselves. But there needs to be that kind of larger strategic calculus of what are they going to get out of it. I don't think they're going at this point. Cooperation between Russia and China could deepen, but I don't. To my mind, at this point, they're not in a place where they would just come to China's assistance because they're such good partners or anything like that. On the question of the exercises, I think it's more than, at this point, it's more than just the ships passing. It's a little bit more in depth. It's not anywhere near the kind of interoperability that we have with our allies, or even with our not allies but partners that we work with. But there is some gradual familiarization, and that leads to higher level types of activity, but it's still at a very early stage. And a lot of these exercises outside of the immediate neighborhood have political goals, right? Of supporting each other in disputed areas, let's say, right? Whether it's the South China Sea, or Russia's European neighborhood, that's, I think, more important for them at this point than the actual hardcore kind of military interoperability.
Got it. Thank you. Toshi?
So I think I'd just like to make a broader point about how Sino-Russian ties is very much part of China's reorientations to the maritime domain. So I think as you pointed out, China, like Russia, is a continental power. The Chinese talk about China as a hybrid land-sea power. So it's back to one of those domains and its front to one of those domains. Historically, China had its front in the continental domain, which was the existential threat from the north and northwest, from antiquity all the way to the Soviet Union, and it had its back to the sea. But in the post-Cold War period, they've begun to reorient itself, where China now says, well, we can now have our back to the land and front to the sea, meaning that the fact that the border regions have been strategically less urgent as a threat has afforded China to reorient itself and invest in maritime aerospace power. I think that actually is the foundation in some ways of China's turn to the seas. In fact, I think when Chinese leaders talk about a strategic period of opportunity, there is clearly this geostrategic or geopolitical element to that period, that window of opportunity that Chinese leaders talk about. So by implication, if there's a window, it can open or close. And I think one of the longer term judgment is, at what point will Chinese leader believe that that window might be closing and they may have to reorient themselves again toward the land and have their back to the sea. So that's the broader point. I think in terms of what China might do if the United States is distracted someplace else, it doesn't really even have to be in Europe, is that there is historical evidence of Chinese opportunism. And the case study that I'd like to point to is China's seizure of the Paracel Islands, a very little known campaign in 1974. Now, why 1974? Well, the United States had just left Vietnam, South Vietnam, in 1973. It was clear to Chinese leaders that the United States no longer had any appetite to defending South Vietnam's interests. In my reading of some of the internal deliberations, it was very clear Kissinger at the time didn't want to have anything to do with the South Vietnamese in defense of the Paracels. The Chinese also recognized that the Americans were desperate to normalize relations after the opening to China in 1972. And I think the Chinese calculated, based on that timing and that opportunity, that they could get away with a use of force against South Vietnam, and it paid off. And so I think clearly we have a very strong historical example of Chinese opportunism, and it's worth speculating as to what motivated the Chinese in the 2012-2013 timeframe, the frenzy of the seizing of the Scarborough Shoal and then the island building campaign that we saw that terminated in the end of 2013. What motivated Xi Jinping to think that that was the right time to do so? And I think I would speculate, again, based on the historical precedent, that opportunism was clearly part of that calculus.
Thank you very much. Wayne?
Thank you. Wayne Mary, the American Foreign Policy Council. First, I have to say that Dmitry is being excessively humble. He has a recent article about the Kerch Strait incident and Law of the Sea, which is essential reading for anybody who really wants to know what they're talking about on that issue. There's a link to it on his website. But if you're interested in what actually happened at the Kerch Strait and what it means, Dmitry's article should be at the top of your reading list. Second, I do have to pay tribute to those who do not know it, that this is Paul Saunders' last week at the center. This may be the last public event he hosts and chairs. For those of us who have, eaten the, we got one more?
Last event here, but not forever.
Oh, right.
Thank you.
For those of us who are regular attendees at the center, I just want to pay a word of tribute to Paul for everything that he's contributed to this institution, and for those of us who have benefited from this institution. I mean, it's really been an extraordinary 20-odd years. I can't imagine that it's actually been 20. He doesn't look a day older than me. But I just wanted to mention that for people who are not aware that this is his last week. I'd like to, since my background is in Russia stuff, I'd like to ask comments on two things about the Chinese. One, you talked about the Chinese and the American navies essentially planning for spasm war. Well, my background was in diplomacy, but I actually did more of my career in the Pentagon and in the State Department. And one of the things I know is that civilian planners hate the concept of spasm. And politicians utterly abhor the idea of having something that is irrevocable, where they lose control, where essentially the guys in uniform are going to call the shots, and they, as political leaders, essentially get swept along by it. They all hate the idea of being Wilhelm II in 1914. And I'm wondering if you comment a little bit on how the Chinese see that beyond the naval planning, but in a system that clearly regards the instruments of military power as subordinate to policy. I am skeptical that the Chinese leadership is really going to want to get itself in a situation where it has to face spasm. And second, and you may already have commented on this, that in my travels in China, I met a very distinguished archaeologist who made the point that in Chinese law, the distinction between historic China and modern China is the first time that foreign sea power impinged on Chinese soil. Basically the first Opium War. And that when they decided, where do you divide the line between what is archaeological, historic, and what is modern? It was not the end of the empire or a republic or a people's republic. It was the first time that foreign sea power came ashore into China. And that up until that time, China's security interests had always been north, west, south. And since that time, it's always been salt water, it's always been seawater. And that this has had a profound effect, not just in terms of naval planning, but in terms of cultural thinking about China's position in the world, its external relations, and where its problems come from. And to some degree, that means that the way they look at India or Russia or Iran is fundamentally different than the way they look at sea powers, like Britain, Japan, or America. I wonder if you comment a little bit about that perspective, which I heard quite a bit in China.
Sure. I should make clear that when I referred to those Chinese articles, they're obviously much more narrowly focused on what might happen tactically in a naval confrontation. So I excluded consideration of what civilian leaders in China might think of it. But I think you raise a very important point, is the larger point about civil-military relations. It's worth putting that in the context that in the post-1989 period after Tiananmen, is that I think there was a grand bargain struck between the civilian leaders and the military, where the military would agree to return to the barracks, become depoliticized, and focused on being a professional military, focused on winning and fighting future wars. And in the process, of course, they got a lot of continued resources where they got a lot of toys to play with. And I think the doctrinal writings has to be understood in the context where they had a surge of resources, where they've had all these types of tools at their disposal to imagine what a future confrontation might mean. So that's why I mentioned this idea of choreography and the danger of them scripting themselves into a first strike or a preemptive strike that looks great on paper, that looks great in theory, but is disconnected from the larger strategic considerations. So I think one of the key questions, and it's not one that I have an answer to, is how well educated, how well informed are the civilian political masters if they were presented with these plans, right? If, in a crisis, if they were presented with these plans, would they have both the knowledge and the authority to say, thanks, but no thanks? That's crazy, right? You know, throw him out of my office. I want you to come back with another plan. So I think that's one of the bigger questions, which is what is the state of civil-military relations? And it's particularly, I think, interesting in the context of China because there's really only one point of contact, right? It's Xi Jinping as the head of the Central Military Commission, and the decision-making process of that one point of contact to the operational commanders. So it could potentially be far more fragile than we think if Xi Jinping buys into this idea that, yeah, first strike is great because we can bloody the Americans' nose and make them back down. And we know, of course, how that went in the past. Your second point about history, very important. I think it informs China's view of the maritime domain. I think you're referring to what the Chinese call the century of humiliation that began in the 1840s all the way to 1949. And the lesson for them is that it was Chinese historic weakness at sea during the Qing dynasty, the bureaucratic dynastic ossification of dynastic China at the time that led China to fall prey to Western imperial aggression. In fact, there's a consensus number in the Chinese literature. China suffered from foreign imperial aggression during those 100 years exactly 470 times. These are people who are counting, right? These are people with a chip on their shoulders. And I'm of the belief that Chinese admirals believe that they have a historical responsibility to right this historical wrong. And I think when we think about active defense, that China wants to push out the defensive perimeter to keep the United States at bay, is informed in part by this century of humiliation narrative. There's also another historical component in terms of Chinese territorial claims in the maritime domain, which I think gets back to your anthropological point, which is when they talk about their rights, they believe that their historic rights, which is of course not recognized in international law, it was the new legal regime in the maritime domain was meant to supersede it. They say no, no, no. Actually, our historic rights take precedent over UNCLOS, right? And when they tell their Chinese citizens about their claims in the South China Sea, one of the common refrains is, we're responsible to our ancestors who've put these markers out there in the maritime domain. How can we answer to our ancestors if we turn our backs on these historic rights and historic claims? So it's a competition between Western conceptions of international maritime law versus China's deeply imbued sense of their historic rights in the maritime domain. And so in some ways it's a competition of worldviews. And I think that's why we should not expect folks in China to change their mind about their claims in the South China Sea anytime soon.
I've got Marvin Ott over here and then 3 along that side. But before I go to the 4 of you, I want to follow up, Toshi, on a couple of points, and it connects a little bit actually to something that Dimitri was saying. So you've both talked about, or you've each, I should say, talked about the 2 respective countries as being kind of having this posture of active defense. Now, in the case of the Russians, I think we've seen a fairly clear case, and I think you and I would probably agree, of Crimea, which the Russians view very much as a defensive operation on their part, and we have kind of a radically different view. So when we combine this possibility that we can have very different views on what's offensive and what's defensive, with what you've been saying about, Toshi, about this kind of temptation to strike first and let's call it a great self-confidence perhaps on the part of the Chinese military leadership, setting aside the political leadership for a minute. Do we need to worry about a scenario that may come a little bit out of the blue for us, where China thinks it's acting defensively? What might something like that look like? What can we do to try to avoid being in that kind of a situation? And that's something we'll get to, I think, in some of our later meetings in this series, the what should we do part. But I want to kind of put it into this question, because it seems to me like the picture you're painting is kind of a scary picture.
Yeah, and I think that's in some ways at the center of the Chinese concept of active defense. So what might trigger active defense, right? The Chinese, because active defense also has a larger sort of philosophical meaning. And one of the key tenets of active defense is we will never be the first to attack. We will only attack after we've been attacked. But the question is, what does the word attack mean to the Chinese? When the Chinese say that we would trigger active defense, it's actually if the Chinese leadership believes that they've been attacked strategically or politically, not operationally, meaning that shots may not have been fired, right? Shots may not have been fired by China's opponent to justify China triggering active defense. So what would a political attack be? Well, if say Taiwan decided to move towards independence in a political referendum, and the United States maybe did nothing, sat by, and China interpreted sitting by as an endorsement of the referendum for independence, that would, in my view, in that scenario, constitute a political attack that would justify the triggering of active defense. So you could have a scenario in which nothing has happened militarily, in which the Chinese then feel justified to act militarily against an object over Taiwan. If you're on the receiving end, that might look awfully like a preemptive strike or a first strike, which lends, I think, a lot of worries about escalation control and so forth. So there's a real sort of potential windows for misperceptions because of how the Chinese define what constitutes a political attack that would trigger active defense. So how to deal with that? Well, I think in the era of great power competition, we have to get past, I think, the mentality of risk aversion. That we need to start to test the proposition about how China will respond to our risk taking in this era of great power competition. Because I think if we think that, well, active defense is this kind of mysterious black box and we don't know what might trigger the Chinese to attack, then that might lead us to inaction. So I think in the face, understanding this construct of active defense, we nevertheless still need to, I think, continue to take risks, prudent risks, obviously, in order to advance our interest in the region.
Thanks very much. Marvin, sorry.
Quick comment. This is
What's on this? Right.
Marvin Ott, formerly federal government, now Johns Hopkins and the Wilson Center. Quick comment following on the sort of our ancestors would never forgive us, that sort of argument. The Chinese stated view that the South China Sea has been historic to Chinese territory, quote unquote, since ancient times. Just as a sort of factual data point is nonsense. There are not even any traditional Chinese names for the features in the South China Sea. They're just transliterations of British names, basically. So, and if you could do a mind game, if you were a visitor to the Qing court, say about 1860 or something like that, and said you wanted to talk about the Nansha or the South China Sea with the mandarins around the court, they wouldn't have known what you were talking about. That was just a place where fishermen went. So, having said that, the fact that Xi Jinping and this Chinese leadership now believes that this was Chinese since ancient times, strategically, that's all that matters. So, you may or may not want to react to that. But the question, if I'm a Chinese security analyst advising the Central Committee, and I'm asked the question, if the balloon goes up and there is a military naval war in the Western Pacific focused on the South China Sea, does China win? What is the answer I put into my paper?
Oh, you mean for that scenario, like right now?
Yeah, right now. If I'm at the Pentagon doing exactly the same exercise, where does the actual deployable operational military balance, what does it look like right now in the maritime space?
Well, my impression, I'm not going to answer directly the question whether it's yes or no, but I think, that it's important to note that I think there's a tendency, and again, it's confirmed by Chinese doctrinal writings, about viewing a future conflict as one that would be determined by a quick, decisive victory, right? But I think my belief is that hope of a quick, decisive victory would likely fail, and that they would find themselves in a protracted war. And that in some ways, that we have to convince the Chinese that is in fact the case as a part of our deterrent posture, is that we have to take away any hope, any illusions that China can do a quick engagement that would allow them to achieve their war aims. And that would, of course, include our posture ourselves, our forward deployments, and our relationship with our allies. So the more that we can convince the Chinese that they cannot achieve a quick, decisive victory is all to the good in terms of deterrent posture. To go back to your historical point, you're absolutely right, which is it's a constructive narrative. Many of these things are either factually wrong or just totally false, right? But as you point out, it's not only just that the strategic elites have convinced of themselves of this narrative of century of humiliation and historic rights, is that they've, in the decades since reform and opening up, have convinced the larger public, when they've tried to sculpt a maritime consciousness, is that they've convinced the public about this. That's why this whole narrative about the ancestors, about disappointing the ancestors. So now they're in a bind, right? Can they now be able to back off from a maritime crisis without having a public backlash, because they've now disappointed the public, who've been educated for decades to believe that these were all China's historic rights. So there's also a elite public dimension to this historical narrative as well.
All right, we had one over here. Yes.
Thanks. Greg Poling with the Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS. The first, on Martin's point, I'll gladly answer the Chinese win in the opening days, and it's a matter of how long it takes us to get back into the South China Sea, because the closest U.S. assets, ground-based assets, are 1,300 miles away until the Filipinos let us implement EDCA. But I agree that short, sharp conflict isn't as short or sharp as the Chinese think it is.
Could I just add one quick? I posed the same question. What does the military balance look like to a senior U.S. naval officer? And he said, basically, we lose the surface war, but the Chinese can't defeat us in the submarine war. Well, that was a very senior submarine commander. So I don't know what to make of it.
Might not be unbiased. But my actual question, speaking about the Chinese tendency to imagine these scenarios that probably don't match the reality of actual future conflicts, it seems to me that the most likely place that we stumble into a conflict in China's near seas doesn't involve a PLAN to USN trigger. It involves either a China Coast Guard or, more likely maybe, an armed forces maritime militia incident with, say, the Filipinos at the Sierra Madre or the Scarborough Shoal or whatever. One is, has the PLAN really taken into consideration that they're going to find themselves kind of halfway up the escalation ladder by the time they realize something's going on, and how they deal with that? And two, are they completely discounting the likelihood of U.S. intervention in those cases and being wrong about it? My concern is that the Chinese take an action that they are 100% sure will not trigger a U.S. response, say with the Filipinos, and they're wrong. And then it's too late to back off. They can't possibly admit that they were wrong. And a completely unrelated question for Dmitry. Is there any concern within the Russian Navy about Chinese polar ambitions? It's easier right now because they basically don't operate in the same oceans. But in a decade, if you have a PLAN presence more or less permanently in the Arctic, how do the Russians feel about that?
Yeah, so you actually raise an even more important, larger point, is that it's not enough when we talk about the naval rivalry to focus on the naval. And that's why I referred constantly back to Chinese sea power, of which naval power is a part. Because I think when we think about Chinese sea power, we need to think about it as a national fleet. And the bumper sticker for national fleet is that anything that floats is an implement of Chinese sea power. And that means it's the White Hulls, the China Coast Guard, the maritime militia, the fisheries. I would even say the energy resource extraction rigs, the platforms, the oil platforms. I would say the dredgers that build those islands. Anything that floats is an element of Chinese sea power, of which the naval is only one component. And I think we need to think about this in a layered sense, meaning that the naval component serves as a backstop to all of these frontline units that engages in all of these peacetime encounters that we have in the maritime domain. And the naval component and the larger PLA component is the backstop in which you form that escalation ladder, right? Should deterrence fail, China can climb that ladder higher than many of its local rival claimants. And it is that combined power. It is China's ability to climb that ladder higher than its rival components, meaning it's the conventional military power that, in my view, confers so much coercive leverage to those frontline units, right? Because the rival claimants have to look at the entire equation, not just the Coast Guard, not just the fisheries. And I just wanted to answer your point about allies. I think that's critical. Now, when we make reassurances to our allies, like we did with Japan, on multiple occasions now, under the Obama administration and through the Trump administration, that the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty covers the Senkakus. That is one of the most powerful deterrent signals that we can send to China, because we want to convince the Chinese unequivocally that should a crisis break out, that they cannot seek to split the allies, which is one of the key strategies, right? Is to put wedges in our alliance system. So I think you raised a very, very important point. And as to entrapment, I think that's the risk that they face, is that some of the tactical encounters that, between those peacetime frontline units might end up inadvertently dragging the PLA in where they have to climb that ladder. And again, my hope is that the Chinese military leadership is very clear-eyed about the risk of this layered defense that they've imposed around these maritime features.
Let's,
do you want to
sorry,
talk
Dimitri,
about
no,
their-
do your part, and then we'll take these two together, and then Rick, your question.
Sure. So I'm not sure that the Russian Navy itself spends much time thinking about, because I think it's more of a policy question. The Russian political leadership certainly does, right? And you see, the Arctic is in general a very interesting area for cross-cutting cleavages and cross-cutting alliances because of the geography and various things. So you see at times, for example, Russia and Canada working together on versus, say, the United States and China on freedom of navigation versus territorial waters questions, because they have their geographies are match, and the U.S. has a differing interpretation. So similarly, but in a cross-cutting way, the Arctic littoral states, the five, sometimes work together to keep out other countries like China from having, while China, the UK, some other kind of nearby but not actual Arctic littoral states are trying to get into the various bodies that make the decisions and to have more influence in those parts of the world. So I think the Russians certainly are concerned about in the long term. I think they're not that concerned in the short term, or maybe, I don't know how many, what the exact time horizons are, but they certainly paid a lot of attention when the Chinese sent that ice-breaking ship through some years ago. And I think that they're also paying attention to Chinese investments in some of the, Iceland, Norway, these countries, and how that's going. At the same time, they have this limitation, which is that they're dependent on trade with China from the Arctic regions in terms of some of the gas and oil and so forth, and minerals as well. So they're limited in how openly they can express any discontent, let's say. And this is a general statement. You will never, you look at all sorts of doctrinal documents and policy statements and so forth, and the Russians are happy to express the threat posed, talk about the threat posed by NATO or the United States, or whatever. They never mention China by name, because there is a desire to avoid offending, because they recognize that they are not the ascendant in that partnership, or they're not the ascendant power, and they want to stay on China's good terms.
I'll add very briefly 2 cents on that. I was in Japan in October, actually, last year for a number of meetings. I met with the senior Japanese Defense Ministry analyst who mentioned to me actually that the Russians had proposed to them some joint naval exercises in the Sea of Okhotsk, and they hinted that that could possibly be followed up by a joint exercise in the Arctic. And the Japanese certainly interpreted these 2 offers as being connected to Russian anxieties about China, because the Sea of Okhotsk is that's where those Chinese ships are going to get around. So there may be some concrete but fairly delicate, I guess I would call them, indications of that kind of concern. So let's take these 2 first. Here, second.
My name is Eric Labs. I work for the Congressional Budget Office. I'm a naval analyst there. I had 3 questions, but I think you've answered one, which is that the Chinese haven't thought through the implications of a protracted war or distant blockade strategy. But my 2 questions are, and I think they're related to each other, is you've discussed the short lethal war strategy that the Chinese are pursuing and building to. How confident would you say that the Chinese military is that they have achieved that already, or at what point do you think that they will be confident that they've achieved that capability in their minds to win a short, decisive war? And then the second question is that there's a lot of discussion within U.S. naval circles, and when I go to forums where U.S. naval personnel are involved and strategists thinking about how we respond to this, do we conduct strikes against the Chinese homeland, against these missile installations and so forth, or not? There's a rather intense debate of whether this is a good idea, bad idea, escalatory or not. What's the Chinese view of that? Would they view that as being highly escalatory? Would they view that as sort of being par for the course given the strategy they've adopted? What are really the implications from the Chinese perspective if the U.S. tries in a short lethal war to take out the archers that are coming from the Chinese mainland?
And sorry, let's take the gentleman next to you also, his question.
Bill Hamlet from the Naval Institute. I'm the editor-in-chief of Proceedings. My question is about Taiwan. Toshi, you mentioned the centrality of Taiwan to that realization of the Chinese dream. And by 2049, I've read a number of people opine that China certainly wants to have that problem solved. And if you go back since 1996 at least, the trajectory from Beijing's view has got to be fairly positive. But at what point does that stall out and become a flashpoint for them?
Thank you very much. And let's, if I could encourage you both to be concise, since we started a little early, I would like to aim toward letting everybody go at 1:45. And I want to take one more question. So please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how confident are they? I think it's worth thinking about this, not in a static sense, but in terms of trend lines. So I think they see a period in which China needs to build up those capabilities, right? I would say I don't know how confident they are, but I think based on that timeline, there's probably more time for China to continue to build its capabilities. I think the period in which things could shift in China's favor is more in the 2020 late 20s, early 30s time frame. I think there's this decade where I think the material balance could shift even more decisively in China's favor. So we should be looking at this as a trend line versus a snapshot of how they feel they are today, right now. In terms of these deep strikes, I think you make a very good point, is that if the Chinese believe that they're going to be struck anyway, right, that they're convinced, and my reading of the Chinese doctrinal writing is that they are convinced that the United States would, in fact, conduct deep strikes against the mainland. If that is, in fact, very much part of their strategic calculus, then it potentially may not be as escalatory as we like to talk ourselves into, right? So I think you point to a larger issue, which is we need to get a better sense of how the Chinese perceive this, right? And the assumptions that they make about how a campaign might open up might actually change the escalation dynamics. So again, it gets back to my idea of risk-taking. We cannot make some assumptions that would help talk us into inaction. That we have to be willing to say, to at least be open-minded about the prospects of a conventional conflict with China that doesn't automatically go nuclear, right? Because I think the typical talking point for those who are inclined to say we need to be very careful and we need to be, very risk averse is, if anything happens, it's going to be World War III. Well, that's a perfect formula for inaction. We need to, I think, open up the aperture about the range of options and steps that we could potentially take in a confrontation with China. Taiwan, I think, in the Taiwan question I think we're talking about two trajectories. One is the material trajectory. Things are looking really great for China. China can now do even more damage to Taiwan than it could 5-10 years ago, right? It gives China a great deal of material coercive leverage, but the political trajectory is going in the opposite direction, right? More and more Taiwanese think of themselves as Taiwanese versus Chinese, and ultimately this is a political dispute, not a dispute over the military balance. So the question then, to fold it back into the China dream, is at what point does Xi Jinping think that he's running out of time? He's set for himself a timetable, but if the political trajectory seems to be moving in the opposite direction, at what point does Xi Jinping says, you know what, time is not on our side and we do have to act in that closing window of opportunity. So again, that would suggest that we need to project out to what the interactions might look like, say, a decade from now, for example. Where Xi Jinping or the Chinese leadership at that point believes that time's really not on their side and they have to do something.
Rick Hunt, last question.
Yeah. So, career Navy, working with Fincantieri right now. And a lot of great comments, really appreciate it. Eric, I like how you kind of shifted this a little bit, got back. I was trying to get to the so what of the discussion as we wrap, and it goes, I think the dimension of time is misunderstood and not calculated enough, especially on the U.S. side. One of the things that I would say is over the last decade or so, we've come up with 2020, maybe 2018, 2020, 2025, as timelines of China perhaps being ready to take action or whatever. So, I'd go, and you talked mid-century, but you also talked, the next 5 years or so. It's interesting, one goes to intent. In both cases, you said regional, except I really think China is more global in the long term, which changes intent quite a bit when you take a historical perspective. And then, what does the United States do? Are we ready? Where is the balance right now? Where will it be in 2025, 2030? And is the U.S. and our, course forward national, strategy one that we are positioned to prevent the conflict by being so powerful that China will not risk losing, or to create enough uncertainty with China that they also won't risk a war or conflict with the United States? I think this is truly political. It's not military to military. It's not necessarily just military might versus military might. It's intent, it's goals, it's timing, where that balance is. And so upward and pivoting trajectories of both nations need to be carefully matched. I would offer, as we go to things like distributed maritime ops, increasing numbers, getting back up on track, it changes that thought. I'd be interested in both of your thoughts on that.
So I think it is about competing timelines. So I like to use the analogy about how things looked terrible in the 1970s for the United States, right, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, and the trajectory began to change into the 1980s. So I think we do have to think about this in terms of a long-term competition where China's trajectory is not going to be going up forever. In fact, again, I think the 2020, 2030 timeframe is an important window because that's precisely the time where the big bills are going to come due for the Chinese, whether it's the demographic bill, whether it's the rural-urban, divide. I mean, there are all sorts of big bills that the Chinese, and the debt problem, the hidden debt, there are all sorts of bills that are hidden now but that are likely to come due. So I guess my takeaway in thinking about a long-term competition is that we have to stay competitive in the intervening years in order for that trajectory to begin to bend against China and bend in our favor again. And I think distributed lethality, is one way of using the existing set of resources that we have to use operational concepts in a creative way to give us that posture that would allow us to stay competitive over the next decade or more. So I think if we can stay in the game into the 2030s, I think that, but by thinking in terms of the long game, I think we would have a very different assessment about the relative balance between both sides.
Let me just, if I can, just say one thing that sort of, as a Russia observer looking at the China discussion, what strikes me as interesting is that there isn't, so when you look at the Russia discussion on conflict, there's an immediate sort of, one of the first things that people say, well, we're not sure we could contain any conflict in the conventional realm, so better not to do it, right? I'm not hearing that in this China conversation, right? Although China has nuclear weapons, the US obviously has nuclear weapons, so I don't know what the difference is or why people don't think that way, and maybe Toshi, you have some thoughts on that. But it strikes me as a very different tone versus the Russia discussion, where we could talk and there are plenty of conversations about how do you have a non-nuclear conflict with Russia, but there's always kind of in people's minds is the understanding that is something you would have to work at in terms of keeping it non-nuclear, and that it might, and even if you worked at it, it might still go the wrong way. So that's something that's puzzled me, and both in this discussion, but in other larger discussions as well. And then on kind of just one larger point is that since we have Russia and China paired here, is that I think it behooves the United States to avoid doing things that push Russia and China closer together. And this is broader than the maritime realm. And given, and this is again sort of a Russia person looking from over here at the U.S.-China dynamic, but some of this makes me very concerned about some of the trade wars and that sort of thing, because I always thought, well, the one thing that keeps U.S. and China linked is that they're so economically interconnected, and that, given that our really negative relationship with Russia, at least U.S.-China until recently was had this economic tie that would prevent conflict, and the less we have that, the more concerned I am that there aren't constraints.
Just like Britain and Germany. I really liked Rick's point about time, and I would throw out kind of one brief final thought on that topic, which is, we tend to think as intent as kind of a constant over time. And if we actually look back at the history of rising great powers, ourselves included, my impression is that there was kind of an evolution of intent that became more ambitious as capabilities facilitated that, right? So that strikes me as certainly something to bear very much in mind. Before we go, Wayne, thank you very much for your very kind comments. I will say, I'm going to stay as a senior fellow here at the center, and with George's permission, I might even moderate some additional meetings here. We'll see, but thank you very much for everything you said. And I guess as my final comment, thank you very much again to Fincantieri for supporting this discussion, and thank you all for joining us. Thank you.